Imagine being Keir Starmer, already dealing with the worst approval ratings in recorded history, watching your Chancellor become more unpopular than the person who crashed the economy in a lettuce-based countdown, and then getting hit with the news that one of your flagship policy areas, the one where you promised to smash the gangs and stop the small boats, is about to get significantly worse. Welcome to 2026, where migration experts are predicting that channel crossings will actually increase this year despite all of Labour's tough talk, new legislation, and supposed crackdowns. We're talking about 41,472 migrants arriving by small boat in 2025, the second highest annual figure on record, and experts saying that number is likely to go up, not down. The Center for Migration Control has accused Labour of pouring petrol on the crisis, with crossings up, removals down, and hotel use increasing. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage is having an absolute field day, calling the government's approach a complete disaster, and the much-touted deal with France a farce. So buckle up, because we're diving into why Labour's migration strategy is failing spectacularly, what the actual numbers tell us about the scale of the problem, why the European Court of Human Rights keeps getting blamed, and whether there's any realistic way to actually solve this issue, or if politicians are just doomed to keep promising things they can't deliver. This is UK Political Insight, and honestly, this nightmare scenario couldn't have better timing for a prime minister who desperately needs some good news. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they paint a picture that's pretty uncomfortable for the government. In 2025, a total of 41,472 migrants arrived in the UK after crossing the English Channel. That's the second highest annual figure on record. The only year that was worse was 2022, when 45,774 people made the crossing. So Labour's first full year in office saw them achieve the silver medal in the Most Migrants Crossing in Small Boats competition. Not exactly the kind of achievement you want to advertise. The Home Office confirmed that no migrants made the journey on New Year's Eve, continuing a run of no crossings over the festive period, which sounds good until you realize that weather patterns and seasonal variations affect crossings more than government policy does. Fewer people attempt dangerous channel crossings in winter because the conditions are more lethal. That's not a policy success, that's nature doing what nature does. The comparison to 2022 is interesting because the government will undoubtedly try to spin the fact that arrivals finished 9% below that all-time high as some kind of success. Look, we're not quite as bad as the absolute worst year on record isn't exactly a compelling political message, but it's probably the best they've got. The problem is that being second worst in history when you spent the entire election campaign promising to fix the problem isn't a win, it's an admission of failure. And when experts are predicting that 2026 will see those numbers increase rather than decrease, even that thin silver lining disappears. You can't claim progress when things are about to get worse. Rob Bates, research director for the Center for Migration Control, didn't pull any punches in his assessment. He told GB News that arrivals are likely to go up this year, which is a nightmare scenario for Starmer. Bates specifically criticized the government's gimmicks that have failed to cut numbers, singling out the so-called one-in, one-out deal with France as a complete failure. This deal, for those who haven't been following every twist and turn of migration policy, was supposed to involve France taking back some migrants in exchange for the UK accepting some legitimate refugees through legal routes. The idea was to create a disincentive for illegal crossings while showing a humanitarian face. In practice, according to critics, it's achieved precisely nothing except giving politicians something to point to when asked what they're doing about the problem. Bates emphasized that the European Court of Human Rights is preventing individuals from being returned to their home countries, which is an argument we've heard repeatedly from various quarters. The ECHR, established after World War II to protect fundamental human rights across Europe, includes provisions that prevent countries from deporting people to places where they might face persecution, torture, or inhumane treatment. This is obviously good from a human rights perspective, but it creates practical challenges for countries trying to enforce immigration controls. If you can't return people to their home countries because of ECHR rulings and they've arrived illegally, what exactly do you do with them? The answer currently seems to be process them slowly through an overwhelmed asylum system while housing them at taxpayer expense. Bates made a particularly pointed comment about Labour's approach. The Labour Party isn't going anywhere near having the conversation about leaving the ECHR. They think they're going to be able to work with nearly 50 other countries to renegotiate this international agreement. That is pie-in-the-sky thinking if they think they're going to get that done. This is actually a really important point because it highlights the fundamental constraint Labour's operating under. They've ruled out leaving the ECHR, which means they're committed to working within its framework. They've suggested they might try to reform it, to renegotiate how it works, but as Bates points out, that requires getting nearly 50 countries to agree on changes, which is basically impossible. Different countries have different priorities, different political cultures, different relationships with migration. Getting all of them to agree on substantial changes to a human rights framework is the diplomatic equivalent of herding cats while those cats are on fire and speaking different languages. The Center for Migration Control's post on X was absolutely brutal. The Labour government has poured petrol on the small boats crisis. Crossings are up, removals down, and hotel use increasing. Failure. That's not nuanced criticism, that's a comprehensive indictment. Each element compounds the others. Crossings up means more people arriving. Removals down means fewer people being sent back. Hotels increasing means more taxpayer money being spent housing people while their cases get processed. It's the trifecta of migration policy failure, and having it laid out that starkly makes it almost impossible to spin positively. Nigel Farage, who's built a significant portion of his political career on immigration concerns, was predictably gleeful about Labour's struggles. He called Starmer's plan to smash the gangs a complete disaster, and the one-in, one-out deal with France a farce. Then he added, "The numbers coming over are huge. Many of the young men that have arrived last year will do us great harm." That second sentence is more controversial, suggesting that significant numbers of arrivals pose a security threat, which is a kind of rhetoric that gets Farage accused of fear-mongering. But regardless of whether you think he's right or being inflammatory, his core point about the policy failing is hard to dispute when the numbers are what they are. The UK's border security commander, Martin Hewitt, tried to manage expectations in October when he told MPs that the number of arrivals in 2025 was frustrating, but that work to stop the smuggling route was always going to take time. This is the classic government response to failing policies. Acknowledge the problem, express frustration to show you care, then explain that the solution will take time so people shouldn't judge you yet. The problem with this approach is that voters were told during the election that Labour had a plan, that they knew how to fix this problem. "It'll take time" sounds like an excuse rather than a strategy. And when experts are predicting things are about to get worse before they get better, if they get better at all, the "give us time" defense becomes even less convincing. Labour has actually been quite active legislatively on this issue, which makes the failure more notable. The Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act became law in December, introducing new criminal offenses and allowing law enforcement agencies to use counter-terror-style powers to crack down on people smuggling gangs. On paper, this sounds significant. You're giving authorities new tools, treating smuggling networks as serious organized crime, using the kind of investigative and enforcement powers that have been effective against terrorists and major criminal organizations. The question is whether it'll actually work, because you can have all the legal powers in the world, but if the fundamental incentive structure remains unchanged, if people are still desperately trying to reach the UK and smugglers can still make enormous profits facilitating that, new laws might not change much. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood announced in November what she described as the most significant changes to our asylum system in modern times. That's quite a claim, positioning these reforms as historically important. The changes, inspired by the Danish system, make refugee status temporary with reviews every 30 months and force refugees to wait 20 years for permanent settlement instead of the current 5 years. The logic here is presumably to make the UK less attractive destination. If you know your status will be temporary and constantly reviewed, and you'll wait 20 years for permanent settlement, maybe you'll choose to go elsewhere. In theory, this could reduce pull factors that draw people to the UK specifically, rather than claiming asylum in the first safe country they reach. But here's the fundamental problem with all of these approaches. They're trying to deter people who are already so desperate that they're willing to risk death crossing the channel in small boats. We're talking about people who have often traveled thousands of miles, spent their life savings on smugglers, left everything they know behind. The idea that making the asylum system less generous or introducing new criminal penalties for smugglers will significantly deter these individuals assumes a level of rational calculation that might not exist when you're fleeing war, persecution, or absolute poverty. It's like trying to stop someone fleeing a burning building by making the fire exit slightly less comfortable. They're still going to use it because the alternative is worse. The comparison to the Danish system is interesting because Denmark has taken an extremely hard line on immigration, arguably the hardest in Western Europe. They've reduced refugee intake dramatically, made integration requirements very strict, and generally sent a message that they're not a welcoming destination. Some people view this as pragmatic realism, others as abandoning humanitarian obligations. But regardless of your moral view, the question is whether the Danish approach actually works as intended, and whether it's replicable in the UK context. Britain's geography, existing migrant communities, language, and historical connections to various parts of the world create different pull factors than Denmark faces. The accusation that Labour has poured petrol on the crisis is worth examining because it suggests they've actively made things worse rather than just failing to make them better. How might they have done that?